Do you feel guilty about your sexual desires? Do you struggle with creative blocks that seem to come and go mysteriously? Jung discovered that these two experiences are intimately connected through what he called the alchemy of libido, a psychological process that can either lead to creative genius or complete stagnation, depending on how consciously you work with this fundamental life force. Before we explore Jung's revolutionary understanding of sexual energy and creative power, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. This research into Jung's most profound and controversial discoveries requires extensive study of his complete works, and your support helps me continue bringing you these transformative insights about psychology, sexuality, and creative expression. Carl Jung spent his entire career studying what he called libido, but not in the narrow sexual sense that most people understand. For Jung, libido was the fundamental life force, the psychic energy that drives all human motivation, creativity, and spiritual development. He discovered that this energy could be channeled in multiple directions, and that the conscious direction of this force was the key to both psychological health and creative genius. Jung understood that sexual energy and creative energy are not separate forces competing for your attention. They are different expressions of the same fundamental life energy, and learning to work with this energy consciously can transform every aspect of your existence. This is what Jung called the alchemical process, the transformation of raw desire into refined creative and spiritual power. Think about your own experience with desire and creativity for a moment. Have you noticed that periods of intense romantic or sexual longing often coincide with bursts of creative inspiration? Have you observed that when your sexual energy feels blocked or suppressed, your creativity also seems to dry up? Have you experienced times when channeling your desire into creative projects actually enhanced rather than diminished your overall life satisfaction? Jung discovered that this connection isn't coincidental or metaphorical. Sexual energy and creative energy emerge from the same source in the unconscious mind, and they follow similar patterns of build-up, expression, and release. Understanding these patterns and learning to work with them consciously can unlock levels of creative power that most people never access. But here's where our culture has created a massive problem. We live in a society that has completely disconnected sexuality from creativity and spirituality. We're taught to view sexual desire as either something to be suppressed and controlled, or something to be immediately gratified through physical expression. We're rarely taught that sexual energy can be consciously transformed into other forms of creative and spiritual expression. Jung understood that this cultural disconnection creates what he called psychological splitting, where people experience their sexual desires as separate from and often in conflict with their creative and spiritual aspirations. This splitting leads to guilt, shame, creative blocks, and a fundamental disconnection from the life force that could otherwise fuel extraordinary creative expression. The first secret Jung discovered about the alchemy of desire is that sexual energy naturally seeks creative expression when it's not immediately discharged through physical activity. Jung noticed that people who learned to consciously work with their sexual energy without immediately seeking physical release often experienced dramatic increases in creative inspiration, artistic expression, and innovative thinking. This doesn't mean suppressing or denying sexual desires. Jung was very clear that repression leads to psychological problems and creative stagnation. Instead, it means learning to recognize sexual energy as a form of creative fuel that can be consciously directed toward various forms of expression, including but not limited to physical sexuality. Jung observed that many of the greatest artists, writers, inventors, and spiritual teachers throughout history understood this principle intuitively. They learned to channel their sexual energy into their creative work, using desire as a source of inspiration and motivation rather than viewing it as a distraction from their higher pursuits. The second secret Jung discovered is that sexual energy contains what he called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that bridges conscious and unconscious content and creates new possibilities for expression and understanding. When sexual energy is experienced consciously rather than automatically discharged, it activates this transcendent function and opens access to deeper layers of creativity and insight. Jung noticed that sexual arousal naturally alters consciousness in ways that enhance creativity, intuition, and access to unconscious material. The heightened awareness, increased sensitivity, and expanded perception that accompany sexual energy can be consciously directed toward creative projects, problem-solving, or spiritual practice. This is why many people report having their best creative ideas during or immediately after experiences of sexual energy, even when that energy isn't physically expressed. The altered state of consciousness that accompanies sexual arousal creates optimal conditions for accessing creative inspiration and innovative solutions. The third secret is that sexual energy naturally seeks union and transcendence, the same impulses that drive the highest forms of creative and spiritual expression. Jung understood that sexual desire isn't ultimately about physical pleasure or reproduction. At its deepest level, sexual energy represents the psyche's longing for wholeness, connection, and transcendence of ordinary consciousness. This longing for union and transcendence is also what drives the greatest creative works, the most profound spiritual experiences, and the deepest psychological insights. When you understand sexual energy as an expression of this fundamental drive toward wholeness and transcendence, you can begin to work with it as a spiritual and creative force, rather than viewing it as merely a physical impulse. Jung observed that people who learn to recognize and honor this deeper dimension of sexual energy often experience a natural integration of their sexuality with their creativity and spirituality. They stop experiencing these aspects of themselves as separate or conflicting and begin to understand them as different expressions of the same fundamental life force. The fourth secret Jung discovered is that sexual energy follows what he called the principle of transformation through conscious attention. When sexual energy is experienced with full awareness and conscious intention, it naturally begins to transform into other forms of creative and spiritual expression. This transformation happens not through force or willpower, but through what Jung called conscious participation in the natural alchemical process. When you bring mindful awareness to your sexual energy without immediately seeking discharge or suppression, the energy itself begins to reveal its creative and spiritual potential. Jung noticed that this process often involves what he called the tension of opposites. Sexual energy naturally creates tension between desire and restraint, between the impulse toward immediate gratification and the possibility of transformation. Learning to hold this tension consciously, without collapsing into either extreme, creates the conditions for alchemical transformation. The fifth secret is that sexual energy contains what Jung called the creative matrix, the psychological space where new possibilities are conceived and brought into being. Jung understood that the same psychological processes involved in sexual creation are also involved in artistic creation, intellectual innovation, and spiritual development. When you learn to access this creative matrix through conscious work with sexual energy, you gain access to a source of inspiration and motivation that can fuel extraordinary creative expression. This isn't about sublimation or redirection of sexual energy. It's about recognizing that sexual energy and creative energy are different aspects of the same fundamental creative force. Jung observed that people who understand this principle often experience a natural enhancement of both their sexual expression and their creative output. Rather than these aspects of life competing with each other, they begin to support and enhance each other in a dynamic process of mutual enrichment. The sixth secret Jung discovered is that sexual energy naturally activates what he called the archetypal dimension of experience. Sexual energy connects us not just to our personal desires, but to universal patterns of creation, fertility, and life force that exist in the collective unconscious. When sexual energy is experienced consciously, it often activates archetypal images, symbols, and patterns that can provide profound inspiration for creative work. Many artists report that their most powerful creative works emerge from experiences that feel connected to universal themes of love, desire, creation, and transcendence. Jung understood that this archetypal dimension of sexual energy is one of the reasons why sexuality has been considered sacred in many spiritual traditions. Sexual energy provides a direct connection to the creative forces that operate throughout nature and the cosmos, and conscious engagement with this energy can provide access to wisdom and inspiration that transcends personal experience. The seventh secret is that sexual energy naturally seeks what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are. Sexual desire isn't just about physical attraction or emotional connection. At its deepest level, sexual energy represents the psyche's drive toward wholeness, authenticity, and full self-expression. Jung noticed that people who learn to work with their sexual energy as part of the individuation process often experience profound personal transformation. They begin to understand their desires not just as impulses to be satisfied or controlled, but as messages from the unconscious about their deepest needs for growth, expression, and authentic self-realization. This understanding can transform your relationship with desire from something that feels compulsive or problematic into something that feels like guidance from your deepest wisdom. Sexual energy becomes a teacher and guide rather than a source of conflict or distraction. The eighth secret Jung discovered is that sexual energy contains what he called the conjunctio, the alchemical marriage of opposites that creates new possibilities for consciousness and expression. Sexual energy naturally brings together opposing forces, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, spirit and matter, desire and restraint. Jung understood that learning to hold these opposites in conscious tension, rather than collapsing into one side or the other, creates the conditions for psychological and creative transformation. This is the essence of the alchemical process, the conscious integration of opposing forces to create something new and more complete. When you learn to work with sexual energy as a conjunctio, you develop the capacity to integrate all aspects of yourself into a more complete and authentic expression. This integration naturally enhances both your creative capacity and your ability to form deep, meaningful relationships. The ninth secret Jung discovered about the alchemy of desire is that sexual energy naturally activates what he called the participatio mystique, a state of consciousness where the boundaries between self and other, subject and object, become fluid and permeable. This state of consciousness is essential for both deep intimacy and profound creative expression. Jung noticed that sexual arousal naturally induces this altered state of consciousness, where ordinary mental barriers dissolve and access to deeper layers of awareness becomes possible. When this state is experienced consciously and intentionally, it can provide direct access to creative inspiration, intuitive insights, and spiritual experiences that are normally beyond the reach of ordinary consciousness. This is why many spiritual traditions have incorporated conscious sexuality into their practices, and why many artists report that their most profound creative breakthroughs occur during or after experiences of sexual energy. The participatio mystique activated by sexual energy creates optimal conditions for accessing the creative and spiritual dimensions of consciousness. Jung understood that learning to recognize and work with this altered state of consciousness is crucial for anyone seeking to develop their creative potential or deepen their spiritual practice. Sexual energy provides a natural and accessible pathway into the expanded awareness that fuels extraordinary creative expression. The 10th secret is that sexual energy contains what Jung called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature that transforms raw instinctual energy into refined creative and spiritual expression. This doesn't mean working against your natural desires, but rather working with them in ways that transcend their immediate biological purposes. Jung observed that humans have the unique capacity to consciously direct their instinctual energies toward purposes that go beyond immediate survival and reproduction. Sexual energy can be consciously channeled toward artistic creation, intellectual innovation, spiritual development, and service to others without losing its essential vitality and power. This conscious direction of sexual energy is what Jung called the specifically human capacity for transformation. While animals are driven primarily by instinctual patterns, humans can choose to work with their instinctual energies in ways that create culture, art, knowledge, and spiritual understanding. The 11th secret Jung discovered is that sexual energy naturally seeks what he called the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage that unites all aspects of the self into a harmonious whole. This sacred marriage isn't just about the union of two people, but about the integration of all the opposing forces within your own psyche. Jung understood that sexual energy provides a direct experience of the unity that underlies apparent separation and conflict. When sexual energy is experienced consciously, it reveals the fundamental interconnectedness of all aspects of existence and provides a template for integrating opposing forces within yourself. This experience of unity and integration naturally enhances creative expression because it allows you to draw upon all aspects of yourself without internal conflict or fragmentation. When your sexual energy, creative energy, and spiritual energy are experienced as different expressions of the same fundamental life force, your creative work becomes more authentic, powerful, and transformative. The 12th secret is that sexual energy contains what Jung called the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone that transforms base metal into gold. In psychological terms, this means that sexual energy has the capacity to transform ordinary consciousness into extraordinary awareness and expression. Jung noticed that people who learn to work with their sexual energy alchemically often experience what feels like a fundamental transformation of their entire being. They don't just become more creative or more spiritual. They become more authentically themselves, more capable of deep relationships, and more able to contribute something valuable to the world. This transformation happens not through suppressing or transcending sexual energy, but through embracing it as a sacred force that can illuminate and transform every aspect of life. Sexual energy becomes a teacher, a guide, and a source of power for creating the life you truly want to live. But here's what Jung discovered that can revolutionize your relationship with desire, understanding that sexual energy isn't something to be managed, controlled, or overcome. It's something to be honored, understood, and consciously directed toward the fullest expression of your creative and spiritual potential. Jung also discovered that the quality of your relationship with sexual energy directly affects the quality of your creative expression and spiritual development. When you approach sexual energy with guilt, shame, or fear, you cut yourself off from one of the most powerful sources of creative inspiration and spiritual transformation available to you. But when you approach sexual energy with consciousness, respect, and understanding of its deeper purpose, it becomes a gateway to extraordinary creative expression and profound spiritual insight. You begin to understand that your desires aren't obstacles to overcome, but messages from your deepest wisdom about what you need for growth, expression, and fulfillment. Jung's approach to working with sexual energy alchemically involves several key principles. First, developing the capacity to experience sexual energy with full consciousness and awareness without immediately seeking discharge or suppression. This means learning to be present with desire without being compulsive about it. Second, recognizing sexual energy as a form of creative fuel that can be consciously directed toward various forms of expression. This might involve channeling sexual energy into artistic projects, using it as motivation for personal growth, or directing it towards spiritual practice and development. Third, understanding that sexual energy naturally seeks integration and wholeness, and learning to work with this impulse toward unity as a guide for personal development and creative expression. This means using sexual energy as a teacher about what you need for complete self-expression and authentic relationships. Fourth, developing the capacity to hold the tension of opposites that sexual energy naturally creates, using this tension as a source of creative power rather than trying to resolve it through immediate gratification or suppression. Most importantly, Jung emphasized that the alchemical transformation of sexual energy isn't about becoming less sexual or less human. It's about becoming more fully yourself, more creative, more spiritually aware, and more capable of deep, authentic relationships. When you understand sexual energy as a sacred force that can illuminate and transform every aspect of your life, you stop experiencing desire as a problem to be solved and start experiencing it as a gift to be honored and consciously directed toward your highest expression. The people who understand this alchemical approach to sexual energy often report that both their creative work and their intimate relationships become more fulfilling, authentic, and transformative. They discover that honoring their sexual energy actually enhances rather than detracts from their spiritual development and creative expression. Remember, some of the greatest creative works in human history have emerged from people who understood the connection between sexual energy and creative power. Your desires aren't obstacles to your highest expression. They're gateways to accessing the creative and spiritual forces that can transform your life and contribute something valuable to the world. What has your experience been with the relationship between desire and creativity? Have you noticed connections between your sexual energy and your creative inspiration? How might understanding the alchemical potential of sexual energy change your approach to both creativity and relationships? Share your insights in the comments below, and remember to subscribe for more content that explores the deeper dimensions of psychology, sexuality, and creative expression.